I never thought I'd be afraid of the color yellow, but after what happened during our camping trip in the Cascade Mountains, even a child's rubber duck sends chills down my spine. Sarah and I have been planning this 4-day backcountry camping trip for months. We're experienced hikers, the type who weigh their gear down to the gram and know exactly how many miles we can cover before sunset. This trip was meant to be our celebration of 5 years together, a chance to disconnect from our busy Seattle lives and reconnect with each other in the wilderness we both loved. The first signs that something was wrong appeared so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. We'd picked a remote trail system, one that required a special permit, and saw maybe a dozen other hikers per week during peak season. This was late September. We'd specifically chosen this time to avoid the summer crowds and catch the first hints of fall colors. Our first campsite was perfect. A small clearing near a babbling stream, sheltered by towering Douglas firs. As we set up our ultralight tent, I noticed another tent in the distance, maybe half a mile away. It was a distinctive yellow color that stood out against the deep greens of the forest. Sarah saw it too, but we didn't think much of it. Other people have just as much right to enjoy the wilderness as we do. But the next morning, as we broke camp and headed deeper into the backcountry, something felt off. We'd planned a challenging route, climbing nearly 2,000 feet in elevation to reach a series of alpine lakes. After 4 hours of hard hiking, we found our next campsite. As I was gathering firewood, I spotted a flash of yellow through the trees. My stomach dropped. There it was, the same yellow tent, at exactly the same distance as before, visible through a gap in the forest. "Sarah," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come look at this." She joined me, her face scrunching up in confusion. "That's weird. Do you think it's the same people?" "Has to be. But how did they get here? We haven't seen anyone on the trail all day, and this is the only route up to these lakes." We tried to shake it off. Coincidences happen, right? But that night, as we sat around our small camp stove, fire danger was too high for a proper campfire. I kept finding my eyes drawn to that yellow spot in the distance. It was like a splash of paint on a dark canvas, impossible to ignore. I could have sworn it wasn't there when I looked sometimes, only to reappear when I checked again. The third day was when things got truly unsettling. We'd planned our most ambitious hike yet, a 9-mile trek along an exposed ridge to reach a remote glacial lake. The trail was demanding, with sections where we had to scramble over loose rock. We'd checked our maps carefully. There was only one viable camping spot near the lake. By the time we reached it, our legs were burning and the sun was low in the sky. As we rounded the final bend, Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. There it was, the yellow tent. Same distance, same angle, perfectly positioned to be visible from where we needed to camp. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered. "There's no other trail. We would have seen them pass us." I pulled out my binoculars and studied the tent. It was completely still, no sign of movement or life around it. Just that bright yellow fabric, almost glowing in the late afternoon light. "We should check it out," I said, not wanting to but knowing we needed answers. Sarah shook her head. "Not before we set up camp. It'll be dark soon." She was right, of course. We went through the motions of setting up our tent and preparing dinner, but neither of us could eat much. The yellow tent sat there, watching us like a jaundiced eye. That night, I barely slept. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had me sitting up, fumbling for my headlamp. Sarah tossed and turned beside me, and I knew she was just as aware as I was of our mysterious neighbor. Dawn brought heavy fog, and for a few blessed hours, we couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction. We packed quickly, planning to cut our trip short and head back to civilization. But before we left, I knew we had to investigate the yellow tent. "Stay close," I told Sarah as we picked our way across the rocky terrain. The fog was starting to lift, revealing patches of blue sky above. It took us 20 minutes to reach the spot where we'd seen the yellow tent. But when we got there, We found only undisturbed ground. No tent stakes, no compressed grass, no sign that anyone had camped there at all. "Look," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She was pointing to a small cairn, a stack of rocks that hikers sometimes use as markers. Beside it was a waterproof camera case. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a small digital camera and a note written on waterproof paper. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical. "Thanks for letting us watch. You two make such a lovely couple." I turned on the camera, dreading what I might find. The first photo showed Sarah and me setting up our tent on that first day. The second showed us cooking dinner. Photo after photo documented our entire trip, including moments when we were sure we were completely alone. Intimate moments, private conversations, even shots of us sleeping inside our tent. The final photo had been taken just hours ago. It showed Sarah and me, asleep in our tent, from an angle that could only have been taken from inside with us. I dropped the camera, grabbing Sarah's hand. "We need to go. Now." We practically ran down the trail, our heavy packs bouncing painfully against our backs. It wasn't until we'd covered several miles that we slowed enough to talk. "How did they get these shots?" Sarah asked between heavy breaths. "Some of these angles, they would have had to be right there with us." I shook my head, not wanting to think about it, but I couldn't help noticing that through gaps in the trees, I kept catching flashes of yellow, always at the same distance, always watching. We made it back to our car as the sun was setting. The parking lot was empty except for our vehicle, and for one horrible moment, I thought I saw a yellow tent reflected in the window. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. The Rangers took our report seriously, especially after we showed them the photos. They said they'd investigate, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. How do you track down someone who can move a tent without leaving traces, who can take photos from impossible angles, who can stay the exact same distance away no matter how far or fast you travel? That was 2 months ago. Sarah and I haven't been camping since. We've talked about selling our gear, but something stops us every time. Maybe it's not wanting to let them win. Or maybe it's because deep down, we know it wouldn't matter. Sometimes, when I look out our apartment window at night, I catch a glimpse of something yellow in the distance. It's always gone when I look again, but I know it's there. Watching, waiting, always maintaining that perfect, measured distance. The camera and photos are in a police evidence locker now. But sometimes I wonder, if I went to check, would I find the missing? Would there be a new note telling us how much they've enjoyed watching us try to move on with our lives? How they're always there, just at the edge of sight, in that yellow tent that's become the color of our fears. I used to love camping. Used to love the feeling of being alone in the wilderness, just Sarah and me against the world. Now I know better. You're never really alone out there. And if you ever see a yellow tent in the distance, maintaining that same perfect spacing no matter how far you walk, don't try to find it. Don't try to understand it. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can. But remember, no matter how far you go, it will always be there. Watching. Always watching. The first camera was so well hidden that if Mika hadn't dropped her granola bar, we might have missed it entirely. That small accident set off a chain of events that turned our weekend hiking trip into a desperate fight for survival. We were 4 hours into our hike up the Black Rock Trail system, a remote network of paths winding through old-growth forest in northern Washington state. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Mika, her brother James, and our college buddies Chris and Devin. We'd been planning this 3-day backcountry trip for months, coordinating our precious vacation days and meticulously planning our route. The camera was small, professionally camouflaged, and mounted about chest height on a cedar tree. When Mika bent to retrieve her snack, the sun caught the lens just right, creating a brief flash that caught her eye. At first, we treated it like a curiosity. Probably wildlife researchers, Devin said, examining the setup. They track bear and cougar movements up here. But then we found the second camera perfectly positioned to capture our planned camping spot. The one we'd registered with the ranger station weeks ago, and the third hidden in a hollow stump along our intended route. By the fourth camera, the cold feeling in my stomach had nothing to do with the autumn chill. "This isn't right," James said, voicing what we were all thinking. "These aren't standard trail cams. They're high-end security cameras, the kind with live feeds." That's when Chris checked his backpack for our satellite phone. Our only link to the outside world is deep in the backcountry. His face went pale. "It's gone. I swear I packed it this morning. I double-checked everything." We gathered in a tight circle, speaking in hushed tones despite being miles from civilization. The forest suddenly felt different, less like a sanctuary and more like a carefully constructed trap. "Let's check the footage," Mika suggested, reaching for the nearest camera. But when she opened the housing, the memory card slot was empty. All the cameras were the same, no local storage, just live transmission to somewhere unknown. Devin pulled out our trail map, spreading it on a fallen log. We'd marked our intended route in bright yellow highlighter, planning to hit specific camping spots each night. Looking at it now, with the camera locations we'd discovered marked in red pen, a disturbing pattern emerged. "They know exactly where we're going," I whispered. "Every single turn, every campsite." James pulled out his own notebook, the one where he jotted down our trip details. His face went ashen. "This isn't my handwriting," he said, flipping through pages of precise notes detailing our entire itinerary, including personal details about each of us. Someone replaced my notebook with this. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. We had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, and our planned campsite was clearly compromised. We needed a new plan. "We should go back," Chris said, but Devin shook his head. "We're closer to the ranger station at Crystal Lake than the trailhead. If we push hard, we can make it by tomorrow afternoon." That's when we heard it, a drone, the faint buzz barely audible above the wind in the trees. We couldn't see it, but the sound followed us as we abandoned our planned route and headed east, hoping to throw off whoever was watching us. Night fell faster than we expected. We had to make camp in a small clearing that offered little protection. No one suggested splitting up to gather firewood or collect water. We stayed close, watching the darkness press in around our headlamps. The drone sound had stopped, but something worse replaced it. The occasional click and whir of hidden cameras, documenting our every move. We found 3 more around our hastily chosen campsite, all too well secured to tamper with. "Look at this," Mika said, holding up her phone. No signal, of course, but she'd been reviewing her photos from earlier. In the background of a group shot from the trailhead, a figure in dark clothing was visible, head turned away, loading something into a black van. "Check your photos," she urged. We did. The same figure appeared in the periphery of several shots, always just barely visible, always turned away. Sleep was impossible. We took watches in pairs, no one wanting to be alone. During my shift with Devin, we heard footsteps in the forest, slow, deliberate, circling our camp just beyond the reach of our lights. When we shone our flashlights toward the sounds, they stopped, only to resume from a different direction minutes later. Morning brought a new horror. Our backpacks had been opened during the night, despite being right beside us. Nothing was missing. Instead, things had been added. Each pack contained a manila envelope. Inside mine was a detailed psychological profile, including information that only my therapist should have known. The others found similar documents, medical records, financial statements, private emails, and photos, so many photos, tracking our movements over the past several months. Us at work, at home, in supposedly private moments. "They've been watching us long before this trip," James said, his voice shaking. "This whole thing, they led us here." The drone returned as we broke camp, not bothering to hide anymore. It hovered openly, its camera fixing us in an unblinking electronic stare. We ran. There's no other word for it. We abandoned our carefully planned route and ran through the underbrush, following game trails and dry stream beds. But every time we thought we'd found an undocumented path, we'd spot another camera. They were everywhere, mapping our desperate flight in real time. Our phones were dead now, all of them simultaneously drained despite being fully charged the night before. By midday, we were lost. The map showed landmarks we couldn't find, trails that seemed to loop impossibly. The drone followed, its batteries seemingly endless, recording our growing panic. Up there, Chris pointed to a ridge where we could see a small building, maybe an old fire lookout tower. We climbed toward it, hoping for a radio or at least a better view of our location. The tower had been recently occupied. Very recently. Hot coffee sat in mugs on a table covered in sophisticated electronic equipment. Multiple monitors showed feeds from the cameras we'd been finding. A logbook lay open, detailing our every movement, our every conversation, complete with psychological analyses and predicted responses to various stimuli. "They want us to find this," Mika said, picking up a folder with her name on it. "They're not trying to hide anymore." That's when the monitors went dark. All at once, every screen flickered and died. In their place, a single message appeared. "Thank you for participating. Phase 2 begins now." The drone's buzz grew louder, joined by others. Through the tower's windows, we could see them rising from the forest. Dozens of drones, all converging on our location. And below, moving through the trees, dark figures in tactical gear, moving with purpose toward the tower. "Run," I whispered. Then louder, "Run." We took the stairs 3 at a time, bursting out of the tower's base and splitting up into the forest. The last I saw of the others was Mika's red jacket disappearing into the trees, a drone close behind her. I ran until my lungs burned, until the drone following me crashed into a branch and fell. Ran until I found a Forest Service road and flagged down a pickup truck driven by a very surprised bird watcher. The authorities found the others, one by one, over the next 2 days. Physically, we were all okay, but the tower was empty when they checked it. No equipment, no logbook, no evidence of our experience. The cameras had vanished from the trees, leaving only small holes where they'd been mounted. We filed reports, talked to rangers, police, even FBI agents. They found nothing. The black van from our photos was never located. The psychological profiles and personal documents had vanished from our backpacks while we ran, leaving us with nothing to prove our story. But we know what happened. We know we were watched, studied, tested. Sometimes I still check my photos for that figure in the background. Still listen for the sound of drones above my apartment. Still wonder when Phase 2 will begin. Last week, I received an envelope. Inside was a single photo of me writing this very account, taken somehow through my closed curtains. On the back, in that same precise handwriting from James's notebook, was a message. "We're still watching. We're always watching. Thank you for sharing our story." I'm sharing this now because they want me to, though I don't know why. But if you're planning a backcountry trip, check the trees carefully. Look for that telltale glint of a lens. Listen for drones in the distance. And if you find a camera watching your planned route run as fast and as far as you can. Just know that running is probably exactly what they expect you to do. The first symbol appeared innocent enough. Just a few pieces of firewood arranged in what could have been a coincidental pattern. By the 5th morning, I realized these weren't messages meant to help me find my way home. They were counting down to something I wouldn't survive. I'd chosen this remote spot in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest specifically because it was off-season and off-grid. After my divorce and the stress leave from work, I needed complete solitude. No cell service, no hikers, no well-meaning friends asking if I was doing okay. Just me, my gear, and 2 weeks of blessed silence. The first 3 days were exactly what I needed. I set up my camp methodically, tent positioned to catch the morning sun, food stored properly in a bare bag, my small collection of firewood neatly stacked and covered with a tarp. I'd chosen a spot near a crystal-clear stream, far enough from any marked trails that I wouldn't have to deal with passing hikers. On the fourth morning, I noticed something odd about my firewood pile. Someone had rearranged several pieces while I slept, forming what looked like an arrow pointing east. I searched the ground for tracks but found nothing. The forest floor was too dry and hard-packed to hold prints. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon searching for food. But raccoons don't stack wood with geometric precision. I rearranged the pile and tried to shake off my unease. The next morning, the wood had been moved again. This time, the pieces formed what looked like a crude sun symbol, with rays extending outward. Again, no tracks, no signs of disturbance around my camp except for the carefully arranged wood. I'm not usually paranoid, but I knew I was at least 3 miles from the nearest marked trail. The chances of another camper randomly finding my spot were slim. And even if they had, who spends their nights rearranging a stranger's firewood? That evening, I made sure to memorize exactly how my wood pile looked before turning in. I even took a photo with my camera. Sleep didn't come easily. Every snapping twig had me sitting up in my tent, straining to hear footsteps that never came. The third symbol was what made my blood run cold. The wood had been arranged in a perfect spiral, with my camping knife stuck in the center. The knife I distinctly remembered placing in my tent's vestibule before going to sleep. The blade had been driven deep into a piece of bark. When I pried it free, I found crude markings carved underneath, what looked like a map with an X marked about 2 miles east of my location, judging by the stream's position. I should have packed up right then, should have hiked back to my car and left this whole weird experience behind. But curiosity has always been my weakness. I told myself I'd just take a quick look in the direction the map indicated, then break camp and head out. I took my day packed, knife, water, and emergency supplies. The hike east was harder than expected. The terrain grew increasingly rocky, with thick underbrush that seemed determined to trip me. After about an hour, I found another symbol made from fallen branches, an arrow pointing slightly north. Someone was leading me somewhere. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was a terrible idea, but I kept going. I found 2 more arrow symbols, each pointing me further along what seemed to be a predetermined path. The last arrow led me to a small clearing. At its center stood a cairn, a stack of rocks about chest height. These weren't random rocks. They'd been carefully selected and balanced, creating an unnaturally stable tower. Tucked between 2 of the stones was a weathered leather journal. My hands shook as I opened it. The first pages were filled with detailed observations of previous campers in the area, descriptions of their gear, their habits, their conversations. The handwriting was cramped and intense, the ink changing colors as if written over many nights. Then I found the pages about me. Every detail of my camp setup was documented. What time I woke up, what I ate, when I went to gather water. Notes about my solitary behavior and potential suitability. The last entry was dated that morning. Subject continues to follow markers as expected. Preparations for tonight's gathering are complete. The others will be pleased. I dropped the journal and ran. Forgot everything about proper hiking technique or maintaining my bearings. Just ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I had no idea where I was. The sun was getting low. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left to find my way back to camp. I got out my compass, trying to orient myself, but the needle swung wildly, refusing to settle on true north. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just absolute, suffocating quiet. And in that silence, I heard it, with scraping against wood. The sound came from all around me, like dozens of people dragging branches across the forest floor. I picked a direction and ran again. Branches whipped at my face. Thorns tore at my clothes. I lost my water bottle somewhere, but didn't stop to look for it. The scraping sounds followed, getting closer. I burst through a thicket and found myself back at my camp. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for the firewood. Every piece had been arranged in an enormous spiral, covering the entire clearing. My tent stood at the center, and even from a distance, I could see it was full of flickering shadows. Something moved in the trees behind me. I caught a glimpse of pale faces in the gathering darkness, heard that awful scraping sound again, closer now. They were herding me toward my tent. I did the only thing I could. I ran downstream, following the water on pure instinct. I ran until I found the old Forest Service road, ran until a surprise ranger picked me up in his truck. He said I was lucky. A storm was coming in, and temperatures were supposed to drop below freezing. When I led the rangers back to my camp the next day, we found nothing. No spiral of firewood, no tent, no gear. Even the cairn and the journal were gone. Just an empty clearing with no sign anyone had ever camped there. But they left me one last message. On my doorstep back home, 3 days later, I found a piece of firewood. Carved into its surface was a simple message. Thank you for playing. Your performance has been noted. Sleep well. I sold all my camping gear the next day. Haven't set foot in a forest since. But sometimes on quiet nights, I hear that scraping sound outside my bedroom window. And every morning, I check my fireplace, half expecting to find the wood rearranged into symbols only they understand. If you're camping in the Gifford Pinchot and you notice your firewood isn't quite how you left it, don't try to follow where the symbols lead. Don't check for hidden maps or mysterious journals. Just leave. Leave immediately, because they're still out there, arranging their messages in wood and stone, leading people like me to places we were never meant to find. And sooner or later, someone won't be lucky enough to run away. Last week, I received a small package. Inside was a single piece of firewood and a note. The gathering has been rescheduled. Your invitation still stands. I burned the wood immediately, but I swear I saw symbols in the flames as it turned to ash. The boot prints appeared on the first morning, a single line of tracks leading straight to my tent before vanishing. Each morning they started closer. On the final night, I discovered what made them, but by then it was almost too late. I'd chosen this spot in the Mount Baker wilderness because it was supposed to be impossible to reach. The ranger had warned me that the trail was washed out 5 miles back, impassable except to the most experienced hikers. Perfect. After the year I'd had, I needed that kind of solitude. My campsite was a small plateau overlooking a valley of ancient cedars. No designated camping spots, no bare boxes, no trail markers. Just pure wilderness and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I'd packed enough supplies for a week, including my trusty bear spray and a satellite beacon for emergencies. The first set of tracks appeared after my second night. I noticed them during my morning coffee routine, a single line of boot prints in the soft earth, leading from the treeline directly to where my tent stood. They stopped abruptly 3 feet from my vestibule, as if their owner had simply vanished into thin air. The prints were huge, size 13 at least, and deep, suggesting someone of considerable weight. But what bothered me most was their pristine condition. The edges were sharp, undisturbed by wind or dew. These tracks hadn't been here when I'd gone to bed. I spent an hour photographing them and searching for other signs. No broken branches, no scuff marks on rocks, no other prints leading away. Just that single line of approaching steps that ended at my tent. That night, I set up tripwires with small bells around my camp. I kept my bear spray close and slept with my knife under my pillow. Every time the wind rattled the bells, I'd snap awake, heart pounding. The second morning, the track started closer, about 30 feet from my tent instead of 50. Again, just a single line walking straight toward me. The trip wires were undisturbed. My carefully arranged warning system of gravel and leaves showed no signs of being crossed. I broke camp and moved half a mile away, choosing a spot on hard rocky ground where tracks would be impossible. I scattered charcoal around my tent, fine enough to show any disturbance. The third morning, they were there again, starting 20 feet away now. Perfect boot prints pressed impossibly into solid rock. The charcoal was undisturbed except for directly beneath each print. My hands shook as I packed up again. I tried to use my satellite beacon, but it was dead, despite having fresh batteries. I moved camp again, this time choosing a spot surrounded by thorny brush. I strung up every noisemaker I could improvise and waited. That night, I heard something moving through the forest, not like an animal, more deliberate, with long pauses between each step. The sound circled my camp for hours, but my alarm systems never triggered. Morning revealed tracks starting just 15 feet from where I'd slept. The thorny brush was intact, showing no sign of being pushed aside or stepped through. Just those same huge boot prints leading straight to my tent. I abandoned most of my gear and hiked out 5 miles to where I'd last had cell service. No signal. My phone was dead anyway, though I'd fully charged it on my portable battery the night before. The battery was dead too. The rational part of my brain said to keep hiking out, to put this whole strange experience behind me. Instead, I resupplied in my car and headed back in. I needed to know what was making those tracks. This time, I set up my tent but didn't sleep in it. I found a spot in a tree about 30 yards away where I could watch my camp. I had my camera ready, fresh batteries in my headlamp, and my bear spray close at hand. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting everything in silvery light. Around midnight, the silence deepened. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That's when I saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, walking with slow, deliberate steps toward my tent. It moved like something wearing human shape without quite understanding how joints should work. Each step left those same boot prints I'd been finding, pressed deep into the ground as if by enormous weight. I raised my camera with trembling hands, but it was dead. My headlamp too. Even my bear spray felt wrong, too light, as if it had been emptied. The figure reached my tent and stopped. Slowly, so slowly, it turned its head toward my hiding spot. I couldn't make out any features in the darkness, but I felt it looking directly at me. Then it spoke, in a voice like stones grinding together. "We've been watching you watch us. Would you like to learn how we move?" I fell out of the tree in my panic, landing hard enough to knock the wind out of me. When I could breathe again, the figure was gone, but the boot prints now led from my tent to directly beneath my tree. I ran, forgot everything about wilderness safety, and just ran through the dark forest. Branches whipped my face. Roots tried to trip me, but I didn't slow down until I burst out onto the access road. A pre-dawn hiker found me there, huddled by my car as the sun rose. She said I was lucky. There had been several disappearances in that area over the years. Hikers who went in alone and were never seen again. The rangers investigated but found nothing. My tent and abandoned gear had vanished without a trace. They said the ground was too hard and rocky to show any tracks. But they didn't find what had been left in my car. My camera, which I dropped during my panic, sat on the driver's seat. It worked perfectly now. There was one new photo on it. A shot looking down on my tent from exactly where I'd hidden in the tree. In the frame, barely visible, is a twisted, elongated shadow reaching toward the camera. That was 3 months ago. I haven't been camping since, but sometimes, when I wake up at night, I find boot prints in my carpet. Huge, deep impressions that start a little closer to my bed each time. Last night, they stopped just inches from where I slept. And this morning, I found my bear spray on my kitchen table empty, just like that night in the woods. Next to it was a note written in handwriting that looks like it's still learning how letters should fit together, almost close enough now. Would you still like to learn how we move? I'm leaving town tonight, driving as far as I can, but I know it won't matter. Because somewhere out there, something is still walking toward me, one impossible step at a time. And soon, very soon, there won't be any distance left between us at all. I should have known something was wrong when I found the first drawing, a crude stick figure family sketched in red crayon, standing next to a tent that looked exactly like ours. But it was a progression of those childlike artworks, each one revealing more sinister details that still haunts my nightmares. We were camping at Lake Chelan State Park with our kids, Emma 8 and Tyler 6. My wife Sarah had been hesitant about this trip. There had been some strange reports from other campgrounds in the area, but nothing concrete enough to justify canceling our long-planned family vacation. The first full day was perfect. We hiked, roasted marshmallows, and told tame ghost stories around the campfire. The kids were exhausted and happy, exactly how camping should be. As I did my final check around camp that night, everything felt right. The drawing appeared sometime before dawn. I found it while making coffee, secured under a small rock near our picnic table. The crayon strokes were heavy and deliberate, showing 4 stick figures, 2 tall, 2 short, next to a blue tent. Our tent was blue. The figures had exaggerated smiles that stretched too wide across their simple circle faces. "Look what the kids made," I said to Sarah, holding up the paper. She frowned. They didn't have any crayons. We specifically didn't pack art supplies this trip. I looked at the drawing again. The paper was pristine, no morning dew or dirt despite lying out all night. And now I noticed something else, a 5th figure, drawn in black crayon, standing in the background. It was watching the family. Maybe it blew in from another campsite, I suggested. But we both knew the nearest occupied site was several hundred yards away. I tucked the drawing into my pocket, not wanting to worry the kids. We spent the day hiking to a nearby waterfall, and for a few hours, I almost forgot about it. The second drawing was waiting when we returned. This one showed the same family, but closer to the watching figure. The smiles were still there, but they looked more like grimaces now. The black figure had gained detail. Long arms that hung below its knees, and a head that was slightly too large. Sarah wanted to leave then. "This isn't right," she whispered after the kids were asleep. "Someone's watching us." I assured her we were safe, that it was probably just local kids playing pranks. I set up our motion-activated camera near the picnic table, hoping to catch our mysterious artist. The third drawing appeared right where the camera should have been. The camera itself was gone. This picture showed our family inside the tent. Exactly the sleeping arrangement we'd used the night before, down to Emma's stuffed rabbit and Tyler's Star Wars sleeping bag. The black figure was now standing right next to the tent, one long arm reaching toward the fabric. The detail was incredible for crayon work. Whoever drew this had watched us sleeping, had stood close enough to see through our tent walls. I went to find the camp host, but their trailer was empty. The information board showed no host had been assigned to this loop for the past week. When I returned to our site, Sarah was holding a 4th drawing. This one was different. It showed a trail leading into the woods, marked with small X's like a treasure map. At the end was another tent, one I recognized from our drive-in, abandoned at a site deeper in the woods. "We need to go," Sarah said, but Emma interrupted before we could start packing. "Look what I found in my sleeping bag." She held up a black crayon, still warm to the touch. The 5th drawing landed at my feet, carried by a wind that shouldn't have been possible between the trees. The stick figures were running now, their smiles completely gone. The black figure had multiplied. Now there were dozens of them, surrounding our tiny crayon family. We threw our gear into the car in record time. The kids thought it was a game, but Sarah and I heard the rustling in the woods, saw the shadows moving between trees in broad daylight. The 6th drawing was folded into an airplane and sailed through our car window as I turned the key. This one showed our exact vehicle on a winding road. Black figures lined the route, pointing toward that abandoned tent from earlier. I drove as fast as I safely could, But every turn revealed more drawings, plastered to trees or floating across our path. Each one showed us getting closer to something we couldn't escape. The road curved sharply, and there it was, the abandoned tent. But it wasn't abandoned anymore. Dark shapes moved inside, their proportions all wrong, too tall and thin to be human. I swerved onto a maintenance road, tires skidding on gravel. Behind us, something screamed, a sound like crayons snapping and paper tearing, amplified to impossible volume. We made it home, but the drawings didn't stop. They appeared in Emma's backpack, in Tyler's lunchbox, slipped under our front door, always showing us, always with those watching figures getting closer. Last week, Emma came home from school with a new box of crayons. A tall person gave them to me, she said. They said I should practice drawing our family. I burned the crayons, but the next morning, they were back on her desk, unmelted. And next to them was a final drawing. Our house, our family asleep in our beds, and those black figures finally reaching us with their two long arms. We're moving tomorrow, selling the house, changing our names, running as far as we can. But this morning, I found a blank piece of paper on my pillow and a black crayon that's still warm to the touch. I know what they want me to draw. They want me to show exactly what's going to happen tonight. I can hear crayons scratching on paper now, coming from the kids' rooms. But Emma and Tyler are at school. The sound is getting closer, and shadows that don't match any human shape are creeping under my door. If you're camping and find a child's drawing of your campsite, don't dismiss it. Don't try to find who made it. Just leave. Leave before they start drawing your future. Because somewhere out there, something is already sketching your final moments in black crayon. And their artwork always comes true. Emma's shouting now. She's home early from school. Says the tall person with the crayons is here again. They want us all to draw together. I have to go. But remember, if you see a drawing of your family while camping, run. Run before they draw what happens next. The crayon feels warm in my hand, and I know exactly what they want me to draw. That high-pitched giggle echoing through the trees wasn't the worst part. It was how the sound kept getting closer each night, and how it started mimicking our own voices. By the time we found the tape recorder, we understood we weren't dealing with children at all. My friend Alex and I had chosen the Olympic Peninsula's most remote trail system for our weekend camping trip. Both of us were experienced backpackers with plenty of solo trips under our belts, but this was our first time in this particular wilderness area. The ranger had warned us about recent bear activity, but said nothing about the laughter. The first night was uneventful, just the usual forest sounds and our own conversation around the campfire. We'd hiked 8 miles in, setting up camp near a small alpine lake. The solitude was perfect, exactly what we'd been seeking. The laughter started at 3:17 a.m. I know because I checked my watch when it woke me. At first, it sounded distant. A child's giggle carried on the wind, seemingly from somewhere deep in the forest. Alex heard it too. I could tell by how still he'd gone in his sleeping bag. Probably just some late-night hikers with kids, he whispered, but we both knew that made no sense. We were miles from any family-friendly trails, and no one takes children hiking at 3 a.m. The sound came again, closer this time. It had an odd quality to it, too perfect, too repetitive. Like a loop of laughter played over and over. Neither of us slept much after that. When dawn came, we found fresh tracks around our camp, adult-sized boot prints that seemed to circle our tent multiple times. They hadn't been there when we turned in. We should head back, Alex suggested, but something in me wanted to understand what we'd heard. Against better judgment, we decided to stay another night. That day, we lost our flashlights one by one. First, my backup light vanished from my pack while we were filtering water. Then Alex's headlamp disappeared during lunch. By sunset, we were down to one remaining light between us. The laughter returned at exactly 3:17 a.m. again. This time, it wasn't just a child's giggle. Mixed in were fragments of our own conversations from the previous day, played back at us through the darkness. Our voices sounded wrong, stretched and distorted, but unmistakably ours. "Did you record us?" I asked Alex, knowing he hadn't. "Listen," he whispered. Underneath our distorted voices and the child's laughter, we could hear something else, a mechanical whirring, like an old tape deck running. The sound was moving, circling our camp just like those boot prints. Sometimes it seemed to come from the trees above us, sometimes from ground level, sometimes from multiple directions at once. Our last flashlight died when we tried to look for the source. Morning revealed more boot prints, but also something else, small pieces of magnetic tape scattered around our camp, shredded and tangled in the underbrush. The kind of tape you'd find in old cassettes. Our remaining food had been rearranged in our bear canister. Not eaten or stolen, just meticulously reorganized. And scratched into the plastic was a series of numbers. 3:17. We packed up immediately, but everything felt wrong. Our gear had been subtly moved, shifted slightly from where we'd left it. Even our boots felt different, though we couldn't spot any obvious changes. The hike out was tense. Every snapping twig made us jump. The laughter followed us, always just at the edge of hearing. It had changed again. Now it was mimicking our panic breathing, our muttered curses, our sounds of exertion as we practically ran down the trail. 2 miles from the trailhead, we found the recorder. It was an old model, the kind that used actual tapes, hung carefully at eye level from a tree branch. It was still running, the reels turning slowly despite having no batteries installed. Alex reached for it, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said. "Just listen." The recorder was playing back everything we were saying in real time with no delay. Our voices emerged from it the instant we spoke, along with that child's laughter and dozens of other voices we didn't recognize. We ran, really ran this time, leaving our heavy packs behind. The laughter chased us, jumping from tree to tree, always keeping pace. The recorders, mechanical, were provided a rhythm to our flight. When we finally reached the parking lot, a park ranger was waiting. Not the same one who'd checked us in. This one was older, with a haunted look in his eyes. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked. "The 3:17 laughter?" He told us the story then, about the old fire lookout tower that used to stand deep in those woods, and the family that spent one fatal summer there in 1967. About the daughter who would record herself laughing on her father's tape deck, playing it back to keep herself company during the long, lonely days. About how they found the family's bodies, and the recorder still playing that endless loop of laughter. About how the tower burned down that winter, taking all evidence with it, except for the sounds. Every few years, someone reports hearing it, the ranger said, always at 3:17, always getting closer. The recordings change, but the laughter stays the same. We filed a report about our missing gear, but I could tell they wouldn't look for it. Back home, we tried to move on, tried to forget. Then last week, Alex called me in a panic. He'd found a package on his doorstep. Our missing flashlights, still working despite being waterlogged and filthy, and an old tape recorder, identical to the one we'd found in the woods. He played it for me over the phone. Our entire trip was there, every conversation, every sound, every footstep. And underneath it all, that child's laughter, getting closer and closer until it drowned out everything else. The recording ended with a click, and then a young voice spoke clearly. "Your turn to record. 3:17 tonight. Don't be late." Alex hasn't answered his phone since then, but sometimes when it's very quiet, I can hear a faint mechanical whirring coming from my closet, where I've started finding pieces of magnetic tape scattered on the floor. It's 3:16 a.m. now. I can hear the recorder starting up in the darkness. The laughter is back, but it's different this time. This time, it sounds like Alex, If you're camping in the Olympic Peninsula and hear a child's laughter in the night, don't try to record it. Don't try to find its source. Just leave. Leave before you become part of the recording, because somewhere in those woods, an old tape deck is still running, collecting voices for its endless loop of 3:17 a.m. laughter. And it's always looking for new sounds to add to its collection. The whirring is getting closer now. I think it's my turn to record.